Morning, morning, monsters. Good to see you all. So today we're following up from yesterday's chat about Untitled Goose Game. So Untitled Goose Game, as I said, is a masterwork in theme park design. And I don't want to talk about the aesthetic side, as I said yesterday, but I did think it would be useful to go back and look at a precursor, another Australian game that is similar but doesn't use theme park design. And that's the thing that I think is quite interesting. So this is an old game. There's actually a series of them. There's about, I think, 3 or 4 maybe, from an Australian company called Jowood, and it's called Neighbours from Hell. And the basic premise is that your neighbour is this horrendous person who kicks puppies and does horrendous things. You know, the kind of like proper, like horrible neighbor, and you are basically tormenting this person. There is a studio audience, or rather, so you've hidden cameras in his house, and you are filming a sort of Home Alone domino trap effect to frustrate him and cause him the most amount of pain you can in the allotted time limit. So that's the basic premise. It's on Steam. It's quite affordable. Unfortunately, I bought it yesterday for this show, and hit a scrolling issue on Windows. I did a whole bunch of fixes, and there are fixes that seem to work for most people, but for some reason on my PC I couldn't get the scrolling to work, which made the game unplayable. Anyway, enough precursor. What makes this interesting? Well, much like Untitled Goose Game, the protagonist is basically trolling. Well, instead of a village, it's this one bad neighbor. In the sequels, he has a wife, and I think there's one sequel where there's a kid, if I recall. But the premise is very, very similar. Of you've got this to-do list of things to do where you break everything down and wreck this person's life. But the interesting thing, and the reason why it's not theme park design, is in Untitled Goose Game, there's a sense of exploration. You don't see the entire space initially, right? It unfolds in front of you, much like a theme park. But at every point, it feels like you can do anything, and it feels like you have a lot of control. And a lot of that comes from just the fact that you have direct movement of the goose, and you have the very physical things of lowering your neck and picking up objects and stuff. Whereas here, you've got sort of a one remove with a point and click. So even though in both Untitled Goose Game and Neighbours from Hell, the way you achieve activities will be very similar to the way other players will achieve activities. So they're both linear games with the same sort of beats. In this, if I was playing and someone else was playing and you filmed both, the filming of both would be so similar because partly the camera angle, partly because I don't have direct control, so there's no character in how I move. So it's the difference between having that direct impact and walking around the space versus laying down a series of cards, if you will, right? It's a small difference, but it's an important mechanical difference. But I think one of the bigger issues is in Neighbours from Hell, you've got this inventory system. It's very much sort of in the legacy of adventure games, like a lot of old Sierra or LucasArts games. You would have these payoffs where you took an inventory item, you did something funny with it, and then there'd be a payoff animation when something happened in the story. And they basically took that and they condensed that into a game where there's a lot of these payoff animations as you do these actions. But remember how I said in an Untitled Goose Game the interaction vocab was really limited? Like, you've got your honk, you pick up stuff, you drop stuff in places, and most stuff only does its unique interaction, and that makes sense because you're a goose. You haven't got finger dexterity or anything. So what you think you can achieve with the objects is potentially everything you can achieve, right? Whereas here, because you've got this inventory, first of all, there is a lot of times when you try and interact two objects that don't interact, and the main character just goes or and stops you from that. So it very quickly enforces the boundaries of the world. But then there's a lot of things where you think, oh, I've got, this banana peel or this marker pen, I should be able to do this, this, and this with it, because we understand the space and we understand what we'd want to do with it. And immediately when we can't do with what we want to do with it, it's like, oh, this is an on-rails experience. This is a very linear experience of A to B, and I feel constrained. As I say, much like how the camera angles constrain you. Whereas in Untitled Goose Game, because you're wandering around the space, you're discovering the space, you feel like, oh, I'm exploring, I'm free, and there's very few times where you want to do a thing with an object and it doesn't do the thing. It does happen in Untitled Goose Game, but it's much rarer, and it's a lot more understandable because you're a goose, right? There's only so much you can do, and they've limited your vocab down. So ironically, in some ways, by making you more limited, you get more freedom. Because remember, the thing about theme park design is not giving the player this infinite play space. It's about making this very constructed and crafted play space feel like an infinite adventure. It's playing with sight lines. It's playing with the activities you can do to make it broad. And yeah, I just find it so interesting because Untitled Goose Game is, for many reasons, not just the theme park design, the aesthetic reasons are a very strong one, which I've already spoken about and I don't want to dive into because it's a whole nother rabbit hole. One of the reasons it succeeded, the existence of middleware and Unity, which makes the production of the game so much easier. Like the Neighbours from Hell's guys had to build their own engine, right? So there is a lot of other economic factors playing into things, but I think one of the key elements that I haven't seen anyone talk about is the effect of theme park design. So when I talk about theme park design, as I say, the first place I read it comprehensively described and well described, I've heard it described before, was Jesse Schell's book of game lenses. It's a good book on game design, and Jesse's got an interesting past because he's actually worked at Disney as an Imagineer, and he's worked with that. But theme park design really much more comes literally from the world of designing theme parks rather than the world of designing games, but it is designing play spaces that you explore that are very narrow constructed things, but feel open, right? Because in video game design, like in this scenario, or rather in the Untitled Goose Game scenario, you have a very, very small play space, a very limited play space. You've paid the ticket price to get in, but you don't want to feel I think a lot of people, if they realized how on rails Untitled Goose Game was, they wouldn't appreciate it as much, they wouldn't enjoy it as much, they wouldn't feel as mischievous. Whereas they have hidden the linearity very well. They've put in just enough playfulness. And like when I go into a theme park and when you go into a theme park, we don't have to ride the same rides in the same order, but we kind of do if we want to be optimal, right? And again, it's the same with Untitled Goose Game. A casual player who is running around doesn't have to do things in the same order as I would, but if you started to see speedrunners or you started to see more optimal players, you'd probably see they do the actions in roughly the same order. I say roughly because some of the actions are interchangeable. It's mostly to do with locality, what's close to what. Whereas in this one, this has got more puzzle element, even though they're so similar. They're basically get objects and set up payoffs in the environment, much like tying the boy's shoelaces and stealing his glasses and getting his airplane up for sale and stuff. There's a specific order you should probably do those things in to achieve it. But here it's just a lot more limited. But yeah, the vocab is very, very interesting on how restrained they are in both. But the difference of, as I say, camera angle makes a big one. The fact you no longer have direct control of the character in this one. You're placing objects very specifically in the scene, and there's very key interactions. There's a lot more denial in this game. You're not seeing it in this speedrun video that's playing in here because the player's doing all the valid actions. But as I said, I did want to have the interactive version up, but I had the scrolling issue. There's a lot more like or no for you to do that. So for instance, there's some objects like the soap or the banana peel and things like that where you can put them anywhere on the floor, but there's other items that'll only work for their prescribed purpose, and that is what it is. And the other thing I said with the Untitled Goose Game about scale, it works really well as an indie-sized game because it only has 5 play spaces, right? It's got the garden, the shop, the backyard, the pub, and then the final little area, which is a bit of a repetition, excluding some of the connecting corridor areas and such. If you were to try scale that up in playtime, you would spend all that time building out the content, testing and the interactions. It doesn't scale as well as a systemic design. But it works really well for what it is, and it means if you saw early builds of Untitled Goose Game when they were demoing it, the game's core mechanics got there very fast. So Neighbours from Hell has a similar thing where the mechanics of the first game to the second game to the third game, really it's more DLC than it is new gameplay. There is some little bits and pieces, as I say, they introduce another character, the wife and whatnot, but really it's a content problem. And Joe would, ironically back in the day, have a bigger content problem than the Untitled Goose Game because these are all pre-rendered sequences. It was a CD-ROM game. So they're using 3D animation, but they're pre-rendering it all out. But there's a lot of there is a lot of content to make, right? And yeah, you can reuse like the angry animation and whatnot. There's a lot of bespoke interactions and stuff, and so the cost of building all that out is it scales very linear, and there's it's very hard to make that replayable. Much like with Untitled Goose Game, it's very hard to make that replayable without just adding more items or adding more areas or interactions. And I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing, because as we know with most game studies, the amount of time people play games is much shorter than people think. You know, most people don't finish games unless they're quite short games. And I don't think most people are walking away from an Untitled Goose Game going, hey, I want more, I want more, I want more. Yeah, the Neighbours from Hell series, they did okay-ish. They did well for the first game, they did okay-ish for the second game, and I think the third game is where they petered out. I can't recall if there was a fourth. Part of my brain seems to remember there was a fourth, but I'm not 100% sure if that was like they intended a fourth or if they ever shipped that. I could only find the first 2 on sale, but I do know there is a third. But with that, I think I've really laid out all the bits that I mean to lay out. I just find it interesting that it's from another Australian developer. I find it interesting just how similar these games are, with them being completely and utterly different. So it's a really interesting weirdness that goes on with that. And yeah, so with that, I think we will roll on into questions, and I'll go from there. So if you have any questions, drop them in chat before we conclude the recorded segment. Whenever you mention theme park design, it makes me think of modern 3D platform Mario games. Yeah, Mario 64 is a great example of theme park design. It does a lot of the stuff that I'm talking about. It has a lot of the same problems. I mean, honestly, Miyamoto's work is so great at sort of leading the player without realizing they're being led. So yeah, no, a great masterclass. I would say the best book I've read on the topic is probably Jesse Schell's lens design book, which I will quickly pull up the name of because I want to get the exact yes. The book is called Jesse Schell, The Art of Game Design. The reason I call it the lens book is it comes with a deck of cards, which is the deck of lenses, which I actually have and I've used many times in game design. It's a very, very helpful tool set to break down. But yeah, he was the first person who wrote about it concisely in a way that I was like, oh yeah, no, I get it. I understand what you mean by theme park design. Playground design. Yeah, I mean, because game design is a relatively young field, a lot of terms are used interchangeably. A lot of times people reinvent the wheel when they're using they're using a different term for the same set of concepts. The playground design, I'd argue slightly different, because there is more of a playground in my head, and from the conversations I've had about playground design, it leads to a bit more sandboxy, but I think there we're cutting hairs. Speedruns of Untitled Goose Game have been very different than other players. That's, I think, mostly just down to people having different lines, if you will. I think one of the things that Untitled Goose Game really has going for it, because you have the direct sense of control and there's a bit of physics at play, that does introduce a small element of randomness, and that really does help break the sense of linearity to the game. So yeah, there's some glitches to skip. There's always glitches for speedruns to skip major parts. I can imagine with Untitled Goose Game with the physics, there's quite a few interesting ones. There we go. Hey Tap, glad you can join us. It's the same with books, films, music as video games. Better to have really good short experiences than a long media. Yeah, so the theater expression that I kind of live by is the always leave them wanting more. You always want the audience to be surprised the play is over. It's particularly bad in theaters because when audience members become restless, they not only themselves become restless and start twitching, but they start making the feel of the entire audience start to switch, because you start to notice your neighbors twitching. And even though you're maybe still really engaged in the play, because people around you are less engaged, there's a social feedback loop that starts happening. So yeah, no, it's a really interesting phenomenon. But yeah, generally you always want to cut off people, leave them wanting more. I think Spider-Man did a really good job of that, where they put their platinum trophy and where they put their 100% or their like completion was really solid, but then they put a lot of stretch goals on top of that. Untitled Goose Game does a similar thing where you finish it really fast and it's not a low bar and you don't have to 100% it to finish it. When you unlock the all goals but one in an area, it exposes one goal, but you can basically move on to the next area, leaving 2 goals unfinished. So yeah, that's it's really interesting, because then at the end you get all of these optional goals that are much harder, and I think that's a really nice way. And I think I'd be interested to go into the trophy stats and the stats on the game, but I don't think most players played much past finishing the main story. Yes. When I think of Left 4 Dead, it makes me think of a little more linear, so roller coaster design. Actually, it's been a while. I'd have to sit down with Left 4 Dead and think about it. But Left 4 Dead is Left 4 Dead does have multiple parts. I don't feel like Left 4 Dead. I don't think the term roller coaster design is actually a thing. I've seen it both apply to story structure and to level design, and I would not class Left 4 Dead as roller coaster design from a level design point of view. From a story point of view, the whole point of the Left 4 Dead AI director is to give you those peaks and dips in the pacing and the story mode. As in, like, they intentionally give you easy bits and then spike up the difficulty. So in terms of that, roller coaster design is applicable, but in terms of level design, not so much. Yes, no. In terms of pacing, you're spot on. Think, when I say theme park design, don't think about the rides themselves. Think about how you navigate a theme park. It's more what I'm talking about. It does somewhat apply to the rides, but yeah, it's more about the navigation of the park and the full experience. So with that, we're going to conclude the recorded segment. For those of you watching on YouTube, this is a live show that we do sort of 8:30 in the morning. And yeah, come join us on Twitch. So for those of you on YouTube, ta-ta!